Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Hail State Debate. It is November/December of 2020. We are still in the midst of a global pandemic, but we are still debating online, which is a good thing. We're enjoying that here at Mississippi State. And if you are on the PF circuit in high school, what you will be debating is resolve the United States should adopt a declaratory nuclear policy of no first use. Sorry this video is a little bit late. We've had a lot of stuff going on in terms of just like my job as well as our tournament schedule and some technical issues. We'll do our best in the future to make sure the videos get out a little bit sooner. It's just been tough when you do it for free. You know, sometimes you can't put it at the very top of the agenda. But if it is useful to you, and I hope it is, maybe like, maybe subscribe, maybe tell a friend. The links and timestamps will, as always, be in the notes below. Use the links, mind the links. That original research you do on your own is so much more valuable than anything that you can get from just listening to me talk to you or listening to us talk to you. And if you like our various musings on the state of debate in the world, you might want to follow us on Twitter at Hail State Debate. With that, let's jump right into the intro. Basically, my message in the intro is simple. I really don't like this topic a lot. I think it's got some problems. Not because it's not an interesting area to learn about or to be educated on, but because I just don't think it stacks up really well as a 2-month-long resolution for public forum debate. And that's for 3 reasons. And maybe by talking about those 3 reasons, I can glean a little bit of wisdom about how to come at a not so great topic, right? So the first one is it herds you toward one main impact, which is nuclear war, right? Good topics give you some flexibility with different impacts. Like, you know, for example, right now, the LD resolution on federal jobs guarantee has impacts about the macro level economy, about eliminating poverty on the micro level. It has counter plans like universal basic income, and they have their own impacts. It has moral arguments about like the value of work and things like that. So it gives you a lot of things to pick from, and you can be strategic and you can argue about which impacts are bigger than the others. When you have a resolution that directly links to nuclear war and the threat of nuclear war, you can't help being pulled into like the gravity well of that impact. That's why policy debaters and sometimes PF debaters try to link nuclear war to every topic, whether it's like transportation, infrastructure, or education, because the impact is so huge, you can't get away from it. Now, you can try to use different impacts, for example, things like relations and stuff like that, and you should have some degree of creativity, but in almost every round, right, the decision calculus is going to get pulled back again and again and again to a basic question, which is, does a declaratory no first use policy make nuclear exchange, nuclear war more likely or less likely, right? Does it deter war or does it not? And as a result of that, it makes kind of the topic a little bit one-dimensional. It makes it a little bit boring. It makes it repetitive. And I don't love that. And that ties into the second problem I have with it, which is if we're going to have one big impact, the real question in the round is going to be like measuring how likely that impact is to happen. And unfortunately, with declaratory no first use, there's not a good way to measure that, right? It's all about these hypothetical scenarios that are impossible to measure. A declaratory no first use policy is about what we tell other countries we will do with respect to nuclear weapons or what we tell them we won't do, right? And all of the impacts boil down to like how countries will respond to making that declaration, to the United States making that declaration. Will it make the world more dangerous or less dangerous? And the answer is we really can't know the answer to that because it's impossible to measure empirically. There's no big data set of situations where we have and haven't gone to nuclear war, right? We've only had one use of nuclear weapons in the history of the world at the end of World War II. We can't go in and like reliably measure the reasons for countries deciding not to use nuclear weapons or not to go to conventional war in places like the Cuban Missile Crisis in Ukraine. We can guess about why they did, but we can't go in and like run a test and say, let's do it with the declaratory no first use policy and then let's do it without. There's no reliable data on that stuff. It all really boils down to us trying to play like amateur psychologists and guess about how countries will react to the presence or absence of a declaratory no first use policy, and to do it in these like hyper stressful situations where the entire existence of the country may stand on a knife's edge, where you may have minutes to respond or hours to respond and the existence of your country is at stake, and we have to assume that countries will respond rationally, and all that we can do is sort of just guess using like game theory and things like that about how a country will respond to either the presence or absence of this declaratory policy. And that's where all of our impacts come from. Because remember, we're not saying that this is our actual policy. This is a declaratory policy. It is just what we are saying that we will do. And that actually leads to the last problem I have, which is in addition to being really hard to measure and not having like a good lot of stats and data and things that you can use, right? The fact that it's declaratory complicates things even further because number one, a declaratory policy is not what a country will actually do. As we'll see later, like right now, many people believe that there's a difference between China's declaratory no first use policy and what they would actually do, because while they still declare that they would not use nuclear weapons first, they're actually ramping up their arsenal in ways that suggest they want to have first strike capabilities. And what that means is, unless you can get around that, unless you're a really creative pro, right, all of your impacts are going to be about how people respond to our declaration. And a big question is, will they even believe it? And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that countries will not believe it. Like, we don't believe China right now. The United States arguably doesn't believe China's declaratory no first use policy. And then there's a second problem. In addition to it not being believed, there's the fact that most experts say that to have any chance of a declaratory no first use policy being credible, it has to be backed up by these concrete additional steps, right? Like, you have to reduce certain types of your arsenal that are the most aggressive types, like ICBMs. You have to lower your alert levels. Well, these things might all be good ideas, and they might make for a great debate resolution on their own, but the problem is they're not covered under this resolution. This resolution says a declaratory no first use policy, and what that means, as we'll see in just a second, is it is a statement of what you would do. So the substantive policies of, like, let's get rid of ICBMs or reduce our ICBMs or let's lower our alert levels, the judge can't make that happen by voting for the pro. They don't, or arguably, we'll talk about whether they do or not. You might want to say that they do, but arguably they don't have the ability to make these other steps happen. These other steps that experts say are essential to anybody believing that we even mean it when we say that we won't use nuclear weapons. The argument would be that they are extra topical. And so for all of these reasons, I just think, there's a strong argument that a declaratory no first use policy by itself is almost meaningless, right? And it's a lot of burdens for the pro to overcome. Although, to be fair, there's not a whole lot of ammunition on the con side, because they're just speculating about what people will do too. And so because there's not like a lot of statistics and facts to hit each other over the head with, it's going to be a lot, and this is the takeaway, right? It's going to be a lot of logical, rational arguing and storytelling and narratives about like what leaders will do and why they might change their decisions and not escalate conflicts, or alternatively on the con, be more likely to escalate conflicts, and being able to tell those stories, right? Not just reading from a card, but being able to explain those scenarios logically and poke holes in your opponent's scenarios is going to be really, really important. To push back on them when they're reading some card that says, according to some expert, this is going to do X, Y, and Z. Well, but that assumes that people believe our declaratory no first use policy, right? So at the end of the day, I don't love the topic, but we've got to do it anyway. We've got to get through it. So the order for the video will be basically the usual. First, let's talk about some definitions and framework. Second, let's do some sort of general background on what the United States first use policy actually is. Then we'll do the pro, and then we will do the con. All right, let's do some definitions and framework. I know that in public forum debate, we often don't read a lot of definitions in the case itself, but it's still important to take some time and understand them, because they help sort of highlight what issues could become debatable, like what questions about like what's topical and what's not might come up in the round. They can help you sort of strategically build your case and be prepared for the occasional like topicality fight. So they are really important to think about, even if you don't put them in your case. The United States, straightforward, right? There's only one United States that has a nuclear arsenal. That's the United States of America. So we're not going to do any weird LD stuff where we talk about the United States of Mexico or different states. Only the U.S. federal government has a nuclear arsenal. So it's going to be obviously the actor here. No first use. Well, there are plenty of definitions of what a no first use policy is. Most of them are pretty straightforward. So, for example, the Texas National Security Review in 2019 says a no first use policy means that the United States would pledge to use nuclear weapons only in retaliation for a nuclear attack. Well, that's pretty straightforward, and that's going to stand you in good stead in the vast majority of rounds, whether you have to read it or not, right? But there are some nuanced questions about like how broad this guarantee of no first use is, like what are the parameters of it? So, for example, one nuanced question is, if we're going to say that we have to have a nuclear attack first before we can use nuclear weapons, a nuclear attack on whom, right? Who has to be attacked by a rival before we have the ability, or say we have the ability, to use our own nuclear weapons? Does a no first use policy allow nuclear weapons in response to a nuclear attack on anybody? Like if a random, country in Africa or Asia or Eastern Europe is attacked, does that allow us to use nuclear weapons? Or would it have to be on one of the United States allies, or would it have to be on the United States itself? Is it really narrow in that way? There's a definition from the Union of Concerned Scientists in 2020 that clarifies this. It says a no first-use nuclear policy means the United States would commit to never use nuclear weapons first, either as a first strike, that is, an unprompted surprise attack, an escalatory move in a conventional conflict, or in response to a non-nuclear attack. The only situation in which the U.S. would use nuclear weapons would be in response to a confirmed nuclear attack on itself or its allies. So this definition limits the situations in which nuclear weapons could be used by the U.S. to an attack, a nuclear attack on ourselves or our allies, not just anybody in the world. And I think that's probably a fair definition. I think if you ask people at like the Department of Defense and the Pentagon and experts in academia, what does no first use refer to, they would say it is a nuclear attack against us or our allies, not just us, but also not the entire world. That seems like a pretty fair summary of what the literature says. Now, arguably the most important single word in the resolution, at least to me, is declaratory, right? And the reason declaratory is there, the reason the resolution doesn't just say we should have a no first use policy, is to distinguish between two critically important different things. The first is your actual policy of what you would really do as a government if you felt like nuclear weapons might be justified as a first strike. The second, the declaratory version, right? That would be your actual first use policy, right? Whatever you would really do in your heart of hearts as a country, right? Your declaratory first use policy is your publicly stated policy, and it is entirely possible for them to be different. Many people believe, as we said earlier, that they are different in China because China right now has the world's only true total declaratory no first use policy, but people look at them growing their nuclear arsenal and building more aggressive types of nuclear deployment and think that really they are actually trying to be able to have a first strike capability. So if you want a definition of what declaratory means, Malcolm Chalmers from the Nuclear Threat Initiative in 2010 defines a declaratory nuclear policy as a set of public statements about the circumstances in which a state or group of states would consider using nuclear weapons. So it's a set of statements. It's not an actual, protocol. It's not an actual set of contingencies that you use in a conflict. It's a public statement, right? It's certainly not like an actual nuclear policy of like reducing, the types of weapons you have or the way that your nuclear forces, your nuclear triad or whatever are deployed. It's just what you say to the public. And this is going to be critically important for a couple of reasons, as we sort of hinted out in the introduction, right? The first one is it really limits the benefits that the pro can claim, but also some of the downsides too, right? This declaratory policy does not mean that the United States will not start a nuclear war. If the United States is in a situation where it's getting hit with like EMPs from Russia and Russian bombers are dropping conventional weapons and they've already hit our nuclear ICBM silos with conventional bombs and they're crippling our capacity to move, and the Russian army is landing on our shores and we don't have the ability to mobilize the military. Extremely unlikely scenario, right? All of this stuff, by the way, is extremely unlikely, hypothetical, dream world stuff. But let's say that happened. The United States is not going to look at that and say, yeah, we might want to use nuclear weapons or we're going to be completely annihilated. Oh, but wait. Oh my gosh, we promised we wouldn't. We have a piece of paper that says we wouldn't, right? In those situations, those nightmare, highly implausible situations, of course a country is going to do whatever it needs to do to survive, right? So what that means is you don't, as the pro, get to say, this will absolutely prevent nuclear war. No, it won't. A country will do what it will do. It means we will say that we won't do that. And all of the benefits that you have to look to, as we'll talk about on the pro, are going to be, what does that statement do? Does it give other countries reassurance and let them sort of de-escalate conflicts? Or on the alternative, right, as the con, does it embolden them? Does it make them believe that, oh boy, we can get away with attacking the United States and not have to worry about nuclear weapons? Let's do it. Or maybe the most likely scenario, does it not matter because nobody believes it anyway, right? Nobody believes it anyway. I mean, let me give you an example, and this is kind of graphic, but like my policy is no punching children, right? I have a declaratory policy of no punching children, and I hope and I believe that in my life I will never punch a child. That said, if I'm walking down the street and 20 or 30 fifth graders jump out of the bushes and start chasing me and jumping on my back and throw me to the ground and start wailing on me, to get out of that situation, I might have to suspend my no punching children policy. I hope I don't, but you never know what's going to happen in a crisis, right? And a nuclear no first use policy is very, very similar to that, right? And as such, there are a lot of scholars out there credible scholars who basically say that nuclear declaratory policies are 100% meaningless, that nobody believes them, right? You cannot realistically expect someone to base their decisions on a piece of paper or a statement when their entire existence is at stake, right? Now, the other big question under declaratory and the term declaratory no first use is how broad it is, like what it encompasses. The definition from Chalmers would suggest that it is nothing but a public statement. And the reason this is important is because, as we'll talk about later on the con, a lot of scholars believe that in order for a declaratory no first use policy to be credible, it has to be accompanied by other steps, right? It has to be accompanied by other steps, like, for example, scaling back your use of ICBMs, lowering your alert levels and things along those lines in order to give people credibility, to let them believe that what you're saying is going to happen. Well, that's all fine as a real world debate. The problem is, in this debate, right, the only thing a judge can vote for or against is a declaratory policy of no first use. So either the pro is going to have to sell the judge on the idea that part of the declaratory policy is the accompanying substantive nuclear policy, or the con is going to be able to say, it doesn't matter, you can say whatever you want, but you as the judge can't vote for the kinds of things that would be necessary to give it credibility, so nobody's going to believe it anyway, right? So there's not going to be any benefits at all. Now, there are some scholars who suggest that a quote, genuine no first use policy would be accompanied by these substantive steps. So the Texas National Security Review in 2019 says a genuine no first use policy would require that nuclear forces be consistent with an assured retaliation posture that eschews, that is, abandons, right, counterforce objectives, the ability to destroy an adversary's nuclear arsenal before it's launched. This perspective thus emphasizes the value of a no first use pledge in structuring operational forces to make them smaller and less threatening. When Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, soon after entering office in 1961, sent a directive to the Joint Chiefs of Staff about strategic force requirements, he stated that the first assumption shaping requirements was that we will not strike first with such weapons. McNamara's directive was undoubtedly partly an effort to stem Air Force demands for a first strike capability and vast procurement of weaponry it would require, right? So the argument here from the Texas National Security Review is a, quote, genuine no first use policy will be accompanied by meaningful steps to scale back the most aggressive parts of your arsenal. So pro can argue that that is topical, right? You get to have the scaling back of the forces as part of the no first use pledge, whereas the con will say, oh, no. The no first use policy is just a piece of paper. The decisions about like what type of force you have and how aggressively it's built is completely separate, and the judge doesn't get to vote for that. And that is a fundamental division between the two sides. It's kind of a debate theory question. It's kind of a definition question that you're going to have to tease out. Because if the con wins that the no first use policy is just a statement, right? It's just a piece of paper. It is not accompanied by any substantive changes. It's almost assured that they can win, that nobody will believe it. Nobody will credit it. As such, it will have no benefits. On the other hand, if the pro can win that a no first use policy can't, and part of it is substantive changes, then you get all of the substantive benefits of, say, having a less aggressive nuclear posture and the idea that that will reduce the likelihood of nuclear war. So this is a huge theoretical question, a huge theoretical framing issue of whether or not no first use encompasses the like substantive stuff that people think would need to surround it in the real world. And that is something that all sides are going to need to think carefully about, write blocks about, and be prepared to argue in basically every round. So with that, those are all the sort of definition and framework issues. So let's now move on and talk a little bit about just like background on how exactly no first use works in the real world. All right, so let's take a minute and do a little bit of sort of general background on the topic, because nuclear weapons is such a rich area in terms of history and theory and study that it's worth just taking a minute to kind of get an inventory in your head of sort of some basic concepts so you'll be more literate and more aware as you go into the topic on either side, right? So we're going to look at 5 things. First, the history of nuclear weapons, very briefly. Secondly, current U.S. policy on no first use. Third, the concept of nuclear deterrence. Fourth, how no first use can work in practice. And finally, the general impacts of nuclear conflict and like what nuclear annihilation would basically look like, because both sides are going to be looking to impacts like that in the round. So first, on the history of nuclear weapons, don't have time to cover it in this video, but luckily we had a pretty good brief history of it in our video from the January-February 2020 LD topic, just kind of giving you some background on the history of nuclear weapons. So we're not going to reinvent the wheel here, so feel free to go look at that. I was like 40 pounds heavier in that video, so you can kind of compare and contrast. You know, I've kind of been working out over the summer. So, but take a look at that. It'll give you kind of the history from Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan all the way through the arms race in the Cold War to the present day. It's worth knowing and being aware of just to be able to be more literate and agile in terms of what you can say in the round. Secondly, something we will spend time on in this video, which is what is the current U.S. policy on no first use? And the short answer to that is it is basically something called calculated ambiguity. And this is per the Department of Defense's 2018 Nuclear Posture Review. And the posture review is something that the Department of Defense does periodically, like every 6 to 8 years or so, to look at its nuclear policies and reassess them in light of new developments. It happened in 1984, 2002, 2010, and most recently in 2018. So you will find the United States current policy on page 21 of the 2018 NPR, or Nuclear Posture Review, and it says the United States would only consider the employment of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of the United States, its allies, and partners. Extreme circumstances could include significant non-nuclear strategic attacks. Significant non-nuclear strategic attacks include, but are not limited to, attacks on the U.S., allies or partners, civilian populations or infrastructure, and attacks on U.S. or allied nuclear forces, their command and control, or warning and attack assessment capabilities. The United States will not use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapons states that are a party to the NPT, that's the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and in compliance with their nuclear non-proliferation obligations. Given the potential of significant non-nuclear strategic attacks, the United States reserves the right to make any adjustment in the assurance that may be warranted by the evolution and proliferation of non-nuclear strategic attack technologies and U.S. capabilities to counter that threat. And just to clarify that no first use is not our current policy, on page 22, the NPR document expressly rejects it. It says, to help preserve deterrence and assurance of allies and partners, the United States has never adopted a no first use policy, and given the contemporary threat environment, such a policy is not justified today. It remains the policy of the United States to retain some ambiguity regarding the precise circumstances that might lead to a U.S. nuclear response. Again, the policy of calculated ambiguity. So the stated policy of the United States in the status quo is basically two-pronged, right? First, we will not use or threaten nuclear strikes against non-nuclear states that are a party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the big, broad, overarching treaty that gives us obligations to do things like secure our civilian nuclear sites, not attempt to acquire nuclear weapons if you don't already have them, right? It's the broad, overarching treaty that the vast majority of countries in the world are members of, and if you're in compliance with your obligations under that. But we do reserve the right to revisit that negative assurance. And by the way, that is what's called a negative security assurance. When we say we will not use nuclear weapons in these cases, that's what's referred to as a negative security assurance. But it's still a kind of a vague assurance, isn't it? I mean, like, what kinds of evolution in strategic attack technologies might prompt us to, quote, revisit this sort of vague assurance? Well, again, the United States policy is calculated ambiguity. We're not going to give you a definite answer. But at the press conference in February 2018, where we announced the NPR, the posture review, the Department of Defense personnel who were there were asked point blank, would we use nuclear weapons in response to a cyber attack? And their answer was basically, well, we would just have to look at that on a case-by-case basis, right? We're not going to commit to that one way or the other right now. It would have to meet the standard of a, quote, significant non-nuclear attack. So even with the countries that are non-nuclear powers, and even the ones that are in compliance with the NPT, we still have a little bit of vagueness about, like, would we use nukes in response to a cyber attack? And we're intentionally vague about that. So what countries are excluded from that guarantee for non-nuclear countries? Well, you've got South Sudan, India, Pakistan, and Israel. They've never joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty, right? You've got Iran, which is a signatory of the NPT, but has been found non-compliant with it by the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA. And of course, you have all the nuclear powers: China, Russia, India, Pakistan, the UK, France, and North Korea. So for all of these others, which is about 11 countries, 11 out of the 193 countries in the world or whatever, we do reserve the right to first use of nuclear weapons in response to, quote, extreme circumstances, which, quote, could include significant non-nuclear attacks. So what are extreme circumstances? Well, again, the U.S. policy is basically we're not going to tell you, right? This is what we mean when we say calculated ambiguity. The idea is to leave rivals uncertain, to make their calculation, their decision calculus more complicated in the hopes that that will make them less likely to attack conventionally or otherwise, right? So basically, what we have as a policy is that we are slightly vague in terms of when we would use nuclear weapons with respect to the 180 countries that are compliant with the NPT. It seems like the only time we would ever do it with them would be if it was something using a new technology like an EMP or a cyber attack or something. We're a little bit vague on that. It seems pretty clear that we would not use a nuclear weapon in response to conventional use of force by them. We are extremely vague with respect to the nuclear powers and the non-NPT members. We basically tell them we reserve the right to use nukes really at any point in response to significant non-nuclear attacks, and that is what we mean when we say calculated ambiguity. And the idea is we don't want you to get too comfortable with the idea that you can use any force against us. We want to leverage our nuclear superiority such that you are always having to think about it, you're always having to worry about it. It's sort of like the guy, at the bar who's like, hey, don't you know I'm insane, man? I'm loco. I'll kill you for just looking at me. Well, he might not actually kill you for just looking at him, but he wants to use that fear that you might do something completely disproportional, right, as a little bit of an extra edge to keep you from being aggressive against him, right? So anyway, you're going to want to make sure you read the NPR itself, like the posture review itself, and maybe even read the transcript of the press conference, because unfortunately, because our policy is ambiguity, because we don't explicitly state the circumstances that we would act in, those are going to be the best sources that we have right now. You're not going to find U.S. government officials coming out and giving detailed outlines of exactly when we would and wouldn't use nuclear weapons, because that's the whole point. Right? Now, the third thing I want to talk about in terms of concepts is nuclear deterrence theory. Now, again, we're going to refer you back to the January-February 2020 LD video. There's some good discussion of it in there, so make sure you take a look at that. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but the basic idea of nuclear deterrence theory is that the damage of a nuclear war, the destruction of a nuclear holocaust is so great that no rational state actor would ever attack a nuclear rival or their allies, because there can never be an upside worth the downside of having your civilization and maybe the world annihilated. It's spelled out in an article about game theory, of all things, from Morton Kaplan in 1958. And it basically says the certainty of destructiveness of nuclear weapons therefore immediately outlaws the attempt to accomplish major goals by military war. Thus, with respect to all areas of the world, the willingness to use nuclear weapons outlaws military conflict, right? This is often referred to as nuclear peace theory. People look at the 20th century and they see no wars between nuclear powers since 1945 and say, hey, this threat of nuclear annihilation must be working. It's making the world a lot less warlike, at least among the major powers, than before 1945, when major powers fought with each other all the time, right? Now, to be clear, unlike the January-February LD topic about getting rid of nuclear weapons, neither side under this resolution is advocating for doing away with nuclear deterrence. The question is exactly how we're going to apply nuclear deterrence. So if you have a declaratory no first use policy, what we're going to do is we're going to say that we would rely exclusively on what's called a second strike capability, a devastating second strike, right? We're going to say we're not ever going to try to use our nuclear power to deter a conventional attack or a cyber attack. We're not going to use it against non-nuclear powers. So we're not going to try to deter conventional attacks using nukes. We'll keep those two separated. But if you ever hit us with nuclear weapons, we're going to strike back and annihilate you, right? The United States has the capacity to destroy the entire world many times over, as we talked about in the prior video. So basically, if you use nuclear weapons against us, yes, you may hit us with a good strike that kills a lot of Americans, but then we will annihilate you. So for example, North Korea, if you do launch an ICBM at the United States, you might just, destroy a city, you might kill millions of Americans, but then you will cease to exist. We will completely wipe your civilization off the map, destroy, kill every single person there. We might even start a world war that ends human civilization. So basically the downside is so great that you would never rationally do it, right? Now, if you don't have a declaratory no first use policy, which we don't right now, right? What you basically say is we reserve the right to use nuclear weapons in response to at least some conventional biological cyber attacks, because we believe that keeping the threat of force on the table, or at least being publicly ambiguous and unclear about whether the threat of force is on the table, is going to make those kinds of attacks less likely preemptively, and it's therefore going to sort of harness our nuclear power to grant additional deterrence to prevent these types of conventional attacks from countries like a Russia, like a China, like a North Korea, right? That's the basic idea of how deterrence works in a non-declaratory, no first use policy world, right? So for some examples of how it can work, well, there's only really one country in the world right now that has a true no first use policy. India says it does, but there are significant limitations on India's policy, which would make it basically not topical, I think, as a model under this resolution. But in China, so Xinjiang Pin, I think that's how you say it. I butchered Chinese names, and I'm sorry. Explains China's no first use policy in an article of 2017 that we'll link to. But basically what it says is China accepts that nobody's going to win a nuclear war, that it makes no sense to try to build the biggest, baddest arsenal. Instead, China focuses on keeping a survivable nuclear infrastructure like underground and in storage, and on it hopes on like nuclear submarines and things like that, things that could survive the initial wave of a nuclear strike from another country. And they would argue that these are not capable of being launched preemptively. Basically, their goal is to survive the first strike and then hit back with a devastating counterattack. And it basically China accepts that many, many millions, maybe hundreds of millions of its people would be killed during the first attack, but it's hoping to keep you from doing that by letting you know that its arsenal is survivable and will be able to hit back. Now, as we're going to talk about later on the con, this is really debatable because right now China is ramping up its arsenal and it looks like it's trying to make it more capable of a first strike. But at least in theory, back in 2017, this was the idea: survive the first wave, hit back so hard that nobody would ever do it, and that's what achieves deterrence. But never use it as part of a conventional war. And so lastly, in terms of general concepts, we want to talk about sort of the general impacts of nuclear war, because both sides are going to be talking about this, right? The pro is going to be talking about it because it's going to say no first use makes escalation less likely and it leads to nuclear war being less likely. The con is going to use it because it's going to say that giving away our ambiguity is going to lead to more conflict overall, it's going to lead to more attacks overall, and that these conflicts eventually, inevitably, no matter what we say, might lead to nuclear war. In other words, if we don't effectively deter Russia or China and we get into a conventional war with them, it's only a matter of time before we see a nuclear war. So both sides are going to be trying to access these impacts, I think. The reason why we use nuclear war a lot in different kinds of debate is because there's a school of thought that says any risk of extinction is ultimately what we would call an infinite impact, right? Jonathan Schnell, writing in The New Yorker in 1982, puts it this way: to employ a mathematical analogy, we can say that although the risk of extinction may be fractional, the stake is, humanly speaking, infinite, and a fraction of infinity is still infinity. In other words, once we learn that a Holocaust might lead to extinction, we have no right to gamble, because if we lose, the game will be over, and neither we nor anyone else will ever get another chance. Right? So the basic idea is that not only would every single human being that exists now cease to be, but every human being that might ever exist in the future out into infinity, like however long the universe lasts, right, will never get a chance to come into existence. So the cost of a nuclear holocaust is infinite, which means even a 0.001% increase in the chance is a bigger impact than anything we can imagine, because it basically echoes in infinity, right? Now, there are those who argue that nuclear weapons can't actually wipe out all human life, and we'll link to that. But if you do want to try to assess like the likelihood that nuclear war will occur under the status quo, Luisa Rodriguez of the Effective Altruism Forum has a really good article that we linked to back on the prior topic, and it says that there's a 1.1% chance of nuclear war each year, and that the chances of a US-Russia nuclear war are in the ballpark of 0.38% each year. Now, that's really low each year, but remember, it stacks and it adds up over time, year after year after year, to the year 2100, and you start looking at an odds that is something like 88%, right? At a really high percentage likelihood. So it's not as though it's some completely speculative, potential outcome. Now, if you want to game out exactly how many casualties you'd be talking about, Luisa Rodriguez actually has a different article that we'll also link to that kind of games that out. She looks at a lot of different sources, a lot of different metrics, a lot of different ways of estimating. And the number that she comes to from a nuclear exchange between superpowers like the United States and Russia, an expected death toll is 5.5 billion people out of roughly 7.5 to 8 billion people on the planet. And her 90% confidence interval is the number of deaths in a nuclear exchange between superpowers would be between 2.7 and 7.5 billion people, right? And the other thing she points out is that they would die an excruciating and prolonged death, pointing out that most people wouldn't be killed in a nuclear blast. Rather, the vast majority would be killed by the breakdown of infrastructure, starvation due to the breakdown of agriculture, just diseases, the lack of doctors, radiation, cancer, things like that. People wouldn't be killed instantly. They would they would die in a horrible fashion, just to give you a pleasant thought to think about. And then the last source we'll cite on this is that even small wars kill billions of people. This is from International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. And they point out back in 2013 that even a limited nuclear exchange between smaller powers could have the potential to kill up to 2 billion people, because nuclear exchange has the potential to plunge entire regions of the world into massive famines due to nuclear winter and things along those lines. So you can see billions of people dying, even if it's not the United States, even if it is, for example, India and Pakistan. So the impact of any nuclear exchange can be obviously massive. How you deploy these arguments in the round is up to you, but obviously it's worth knowing. So those are the basic concepts that you want to be aware of, just to be kind of literate on the topic. So with that, now let's finally move along and get to the part you've all been waiting for, which is the pro arguments followed by the con arguments. All right, so at long last, it's time to finally get to some substantive arguments, starting with the pro. The more I have prepared on this topic, the more I think that the con has a little bit of a strategic advantage, but that's all the more reason why you just need to take a little bit of extra time and make sure that you frame the pro in an advantageous way, right? And so on that note, I think to start with, it's really important that you begin the case, or consider beginning the case, with an observation or a definition of no first use that argues that it carries with it these substantive steps to scale back U.S. aggression in its nuclear deployment in a way that gives it credibility, right? So, for example, the Texas National Security Review card from 2019 that says that a true no first use policy would have to be accompanied by measurable scaling back of the size and the aggressiveness of U.S. nuclear deployment is going to be a really important, like, sort of key prerequisite for most pro cases. And that's true for two reasons. First of all, because in order to access really any benefits of like de-escalation or better relations or whatever, you're going to have to show that people will believe it. And so many of the scholars out there, even the ones that are really favorable for the pro, are going to say that nobody's going to believe this unless it's accompanied by these measurable steps. So you're going to want to argue that the declaratory no first use policy is a package deal, like using the Texas National Security Review card and maybe some other things if you can find them. It's a package deal, and it carries with it these tangible steps that would need to be taken to make it work, right? Just like if you pass a piece of legislation, it might be implied that it carries with it, you know, the steps needed to set up the agency. Well, a declaratory no first use policy, you would say, as the pro, implicitly must carry with it some tangible steps to give it credibility, because if you don't have those, nobody's going to believe you, and you can't access really any of the benefits from it. The second thing, though, and the second advantage is if you can win this idea that you get as part of the deal, this sort of scaling back, is you get the tangible real world benefits of a less aggressive U.S. nuclear posture, which does at least slightly reduce the likelihood of a nuclear exchange, you know, measurably, right? And that is a huge, well, not a huge, but it's a significant locked in real world advantage that gives you a benefit in comparison to the con. So having talked about the framework, let's talk about some specific arguments, right? So the first thing I think you need to establish is that we don't need nuclear deterrence for really almost anything that could happen short of a nuclear attack. And the argument is conventional forces are more than sufficient to deter any non-nuclear attack. And this comes from the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. And as you can see, you know, on the card, we pop it up on the screen, forward deployments of U.S. conventional forces paired with strong and unwavering political commitments play the most immediate roles in deterring aggression against the United States and its allies. We maintain thousands of troops, hundreds of ships, and commands around the world to balance crisis zones and aggression. We have advanced conventional capabilities, including intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. Basically, you're going to want to make the argument that the United States has, you know, a navy that outclasses all of the other navies in the world combined, that we have some of the most advanced technology, one of the larger armies, if not the largest, but one of the larger ones with the best equipment, the best training, bases all over the world. You can pick your favorite source on this. You can watch YouTube videos on it. There's plenty of examples of how the United States thoroughly outclasses other countries in terms of its conventional capabilities. Although, to be fair, on the con, there are arguments that other countries are catching up, right? If you look to just total spending, the Peter G. Peterson Foundation in 2019 shows us that the U.S. spends more annually on defense at $732 billion than the next 10 countries combined, more than 4 times as much as China at $178 billion and 10 times as much as Russia at $65 billion. We would be the overwhelming favorite in any conventional war and have more than enough capacity to deter any non-nuclear threat with non-nuclear overwhelming conventional force. This dovetails with another argument, which is that really the only rationale for having a first use optional policy, in other words, allowing first use, right, would be to deter conventional conflicts that really don't happen anymore, right? This idea of reserving the right to use nuclear weapons in response to non-nuclear attacks is kind of a relic of the Cold War. And this comes from a guy named John Holdren in 2020 in The Overwhelming Case for No First Use, which is just a really good article to read. And he gives this really good synopsis of where the idea of what was called the first use if necessary policy came from. And it goes all the way back to like the 1948 Berlin crisis following World War II. And the basic idea was back then, Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, right, had an overwhelmingly superior conventional military in Europe. And the United States and its allies in Europe were worried that if that force were to just sort of run rampant through Eastern Europe and Central Europe, it could basically bulldoze its way to conquest in a similar way to how Germany had before, right? And so one of the things we did was we tried to make them worry about our superior nuclear arsenal by developing things like battlefield nuclear weapons and tactical nuclear weapons, and sort of making them think that we could deploy, smaller nuclear weapons against their forces, like blow up tank divisions with a massive nuclear weapon and things like that. And we wanted them to believe that we could balance their superior force with nuclear weapons. Well, that's nothing like the world that exists today, right? We really don't have, we still have tactical nuclear weapons, but they've never been used. They're a tiny part of the U.S. arsenal. We have conventional weapons, like conventional munitions like the Moab, the mother of all bombs, that are better at blowing up bunkers and things. And more importantly, Russia, the Soviet Union doesn't exist, and Russia is not by any stretch of the imagination a superior conventional force anymore. They're not. NATO has secured Europe. Russia, although they have invaded Ukraine and Crimea, is not a serious threat to bulldoze through Europe anymore. And even if they did, we're not making any serious threat to hit them with like battlefield nuclear weapons. So the whole reason we came up with this theory to like try to counterbalance a superior conventional force with battlefield nuclear weapons, neither one of those things exists anymore, right? And if you can paraphrase Holdren, he can, you can sort of argue in the round that the whole reason we had this policy is a relic of an era where these realities don't exist anymore, and this is a policy that has no use in the modern age. And I think that's a good argument. Even if you don't make it a contention in your case, being able to explain it and say it in Crossfire and things like that, and say, well, actually, this whole thing stems back to the Berlin crisis in 1948, and it's about Soviet domination. Boy, you could, really make yourself sound smart with that, right? You also want to be able to argue that in the modern world, this is another potential contention, nuclear weapons don't deter conventional conflict. Remember, the whole idea of a first use optional policy, right, is the idea that maybe the threat of nuclear weapons could prevent a conventional war or a cyber attack or something like that. And there actually is some empirical research on this, not a ton. This is from Geller in 1990, and it says just beyond just the history and logic of it, there is at least some scholarly empirical evidence that nuclear weapons just don't work in deterring conventional attack. And what Geller says is, in his study of like historical studies of different conflicts between powers, it was demonstrated that disputes between nuclear powers are more likely to escalate short of war than are non-nuclear disputes. And in conflicts between nuclear and non-nuclear states, the possession of nuclear weapons has no evident inhibitory effect on the escalation propensities of the non-nuclear opponent. So this is a historical summary from a reputable scholar that says, look, looking at the facts, at least up until 1990, and it is a little bit dated, but the world hasn't, we haven't seen the use of nuclear weapons since then, right? But at least up until 1990, he's looking at the history of it and saying, people just don't believe you're going to use a nuclear weapon against them in response to a local skirmish or between a couple of ships or a small fight between two powers in some town somewhere. They know it's not going to happen, so it doesn't really work as a deterrent. And so that's a good piece of empirical evidence if you want some scholarly proof to go with your anecdotes and your statements from, Department of Defense folks, right? Another point that you really want to make, sort of the core of some of the pro arguments, is the idea that no first use, of course, is going to hopefully reduce the likelihood of nuclear exchanges. And there are really sort of two different permutations of this, right? So the first one is that no first use can reduce the likelihood of intentional nuclear exchanges. These are the ones where we sort of mean to go to nuclear war with each other, like deliberately. So this is from Bruce Blair of Princeton, the Woodrow Wilson School in 2018. Here's what it says. Forswearing first use would not only enhance stability, but also could enable smarter investments in nuclear weapons, stabilize nuclear crises, raise the threshold of nuclear use, reduce the risk of initiating a nuclear strike on the basis of faulty intelligence, open up a new avenue for controlling the dangerous and accelerating nuclear competition between Washington and Moscow. If the next president adopts this policy, they could then push the levers of every other nuclear armed state to do so. India and China already have. Anything less threatens to undermine the fragile logic of deterrence and can result in a nuclear catastrophe the world had hoped was left behind in the history books. So the basic idea here is what you're going to want to do is pair this with some of the impacts we talked about earlier about how the death toll from a nuclear war will be massive, or maybe even the argument that it would be an infinite impact because all human beings would cease to exist. And the idea is that even if not everybody believes it, and even if it doesn't work perfectly, if a no first use policy even slightly taps the brakes, even slightly reduces the level of alertness and paranoia that we feel between each other as countries, even if it reduces it by 0.1%, when you multiply that by billions of deaths, that's a huge expected upside in reducing even the slightest possibility of a nuclear exchange, and that's a good thing to have, right? Now, the second argument in terms of reducing the likelihood is, this is from Tannenwald of the Texas National Security Review in 2019. It's the idea that it reduces the likelihood of an accidental nuclear exchange through miscalculation. And this assumes, right, as we said earlier, that you're going to be actually getting these sort of package deal of like lowering the level of alertness and lowering the level of aggression. And if you persuade the judge that that's true, right, and if we lower our alert level and if we lower our deployment of the most aggressive nuclear weapons, that reduces the likelihood of things like mistake, right? Launching by mistake. So, for example, there have been instances throughout, the history of the United States where we've gotten perilously close to nuclear annihilation because people in this country or people in Russia have looked at the radar and seen something incoming that they thought looked like an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, but really wasn't. And they had to make these split-second decisions, right, about, whether to fire or not. And the argument would be if our nuclear alert is just a little bit slower, right? If we're not on super high alert, if we're not on like launch on warning status is what they call it sometimes, it might give us just a few extra minutes, to think about, right, the prospect of launching that missile. So if we go with a no first use policy and we back it up with steps to de-escalate the aggression of our nuclear arsenal, it buys us a few extra minutes, and that few extra minutes, there's no downside to it, right? Those few extra minutes might give us an opportunity to think and breathe and think clearly and not launch World War III and not destroy the entire human species, right? So that's the argument there. The other argument that a lot of people are making is that it will help improve our credibility on non-proliferation. So this also comes from Holdren back in 2020. When the country with the most capable conventional forces the world has ever seen insists that it nonetheless needs nuclear weapons to deter and respond to non-nuclear attacks, it is logically conceding to any country that fears or professes to fear attack by another the right to acquire its own nuclear weapons to deter or respond to such attacks, right? So basically it gives away the United States moral authority to say, you don't need to seek nuclear weapons. You need to follow the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, the obvious response to this that we'll talk about later to some extent is that we don't achieve non-proliferation because of our moral authority. People don't not seek to acquire nuclear weapons because they think the United States is moral. They don't acquire nuclear weapons because we promise to protect them and we promise to give them benefits, like trading with them and benefiting them in other ways if they don't acquire nuclear weapons, and we threaten to be their adversary if they do, right? So it's really not about moral authority. Other countries don't act because they think the United States is moral. They act because they think the United States is rich and powerful. But nonetheless, it's an argument that a lot of people are going to try to make. So just be aware of it, right? And then, sort of the last point, I guess, on the pro would be this idea that it's sort of a defensive point of responding to what the con might say. The con is potentially going to try to argue that a no first use policy will undermine the confidence of our allies. They'll be worried that we will no longer protect them. Couple of things. First of all, you can get around that by using the definition that we talked about earlier in the definition section that talks about how no first use extends to any attack on the U.S. or its allies, right? And so John Holdren in 2020 says the argument that Germany, Japan, and South Korea would necessarily resist and resent a U.S. shift to no first use and indeed might be propelled into acquiring their own nuclear deterrent is questionable. First of all, nobody's proposing that the U.S. nuclear umbrella deterring nuclear threats or attacks against U.S. allies would be withdrawn under no first use. To misunderstand this reality is to conflate the two forms of extension in the term extended deterrence. Extension of the nuclear umbrella to protect allies as opposed to extension to cover non-nuclear threats. So what he's basically saying is that all of the evidence about why these allies would get worried and seek their own weapons assumes that we would basically be, abandoning them entirely, even to a nuclear attack. And that's not what no first use is, right? We would absolutely state that if you used a nuclear weapon against Germany, Japan, or South Korea or another ally, we would absolutely reserve the right to use nuclear weapons against you. And we're not required to say anything else in order to accomplish no first use. So those are the basic pro arguments. I got to be honest with you, they're kind of vanilla, right? A lot of it is dependent upon like whether people believe us or not. I think the con, frankly, to me is a lot more exciting. So it's the one I would try to get if I won the flip. So without further ado, let's move on then and talk a little bit about the con arguments. All right, so I'm not going to lie, I actually like the con a lot better. I think, frankly, for me, it'd be a lot more fun to debate just because I'm kind of a cynic and I'm a little bit skeptical a lot of these arguments in international relations that if we do the nice, high-minded thing, then all these other countries will follow along behind us. And I think there's some really strong arguments here that that's just not the case and that this is going to be a whole lot of nothing with no upside and some potential moderate downsides. So let me explain what I mean. The first argument I have is the con. I think it's really important. Almost every con should probably run it, is that nobody will believe us, right? A declaratory no first use policy has no bearing on what the U.S. would actually do during a military crisis situation. Now, I understand we talked earlier, Texas National Security Review 2019, we're going to try to argue that there's this package deal and everything. But if you're the con, you need to just say, no, look, a declaratory no first use policy is a public statement. It's a piece of paper. That's all it is. It's us saying what we would do during a crisis. And just like my policy of no punching children, as I mentioned earlier, it's a great idea, but when push comes to shove and things are really bad, you're not going to worry about what that piece of paper says. It's just a statement. It doesn't actually control what we do. And there's a really good summary of like how this argument works by Jeffrey Lewis in 2010, where he basically argues, look, international relations are complicated. Nobody believes any absolute categorical statement that countries make because they know that they're just going to follow their best interest when push comes to shove. And so we will link to that article and I'd suggest you read it. But basically, because all the potential benefits of no first use, from de-escalation to non-proliferation to international relations, everything, all of them assume that other countries will believe us. This contention is an immediate takeout. It's like nuking, right? The opponent's case if you can win it. If you win, nobody believes us. Not only is it potentially strong offense for the con, depending on what you link it to, it can take out the entire pro case, right? And there's a great explanation of it from a guy named John Harvey. Great last name. These Harvey people really know what they're talking about, right? He's a former Department of Defense official back in 2019, wrote a great piece in an online journal called War on the Rocks. And I'm just going to read some of it because I think it explains the they won't believe us argument in really plain language. It would be good for PF, good for judges. A no first use pledge is unlikely to appear credible to an adversary contemplating major aggression. For example, North Korea is unlikely to base any military planning to reunify the Korean peninsula by force or plans for its regime survival after an unsuccessful effort to achieve that objective on a U.S. promise of no first use. Consider China's existing no first use pledge, which has not caused the United States to moderate its own nuclear posture one iota. And that's a great point. You can ask the pro this, hey, China's got this no first use pledge. Has it in any measurable way changed how the United States plans its defense against or aggression toward China? Can you cite any source that shows that the United States has in any way altered its posture toward China, or that anybody has altered their posture toward China as a result of its no first use pledge? If you can't, how can we possibly affirm, right? Going back to the quote, few states will risk their national security based on a declaratory policy that can be reversed overnight. Dominic Tierney, an academic who supports a no first use policy, eloquently addresses this point. And now we're quoting Tierney, right? Viewed through a strategic and perhaps more cynical lens, the no first use doctrine also has a huge credibility problem. For the U.S. pledge to truly matter, a president who otherwise favors a nuclear strike would have to decide not to press the button because of this policy. But in an extreme national crisis, one involving involving, say, North Korean nuclear missiles, a president is unlikely to feel bound by America's former assurance. After all, if a country is willing to use nuclear weapons, it's also willing to break a promise. Exactly, right? What's the downside of breaking your international promise? I don't know, you get some international criticism. If you're the United States, it's not a whole heck of a lot. We break our promises all the time. We break treaties all the time. We're still the most powerful country in the world. And in a situation where nuclear annihilation is on the line, those interests are going to be so small as to be absolutely trivial. Back to quoting John Harvey. Second, it's not at all clear that an adversary could count on U.S. public opinion to act as a brake on an American president contemplating first use in response to a catastrophic non-nuclear attack. Several surveys conducted by Scott Sagan and Ben Valentino look at the American public's willingness to support first use under such circumstances. The results reveal a surprising level of support. Okay, so here again, even if we made this declaration, a president is not going to look at the vast majority of Americans who say, do whatever it takes to keep us alive and help us survive, and say, oh, you know, we signed that paper, we wrote that policy, and we put it on the internet a while back. They're not going to care. And more importantly, our rivals like Russia and China and North Korea, they know we won't care. They would frankly think it was silly for us to make a declaration like this, or at least they would know that we're misleading them, right? Sagan and Valentino thus argue, would we drop the bomb again? Our surveys can't say how future presidents and their top advisors would weigh their options, but they do reveal something unsettling about the instincts of the U.S. public. When provoked, we don't seem to consider the use of nuclear weapons a taboo, and our commitment to the immaturity of civilians from deliberate attack, the immunity of civilians from deliberate attack in wartime, even with vast casualties, is shallow. Today, as in 1945, the U.S. public is unlikely to hold back a president who might consider using nuclear weapons in the crucible of war. You know, it looks like Joe Biden's going to be our president going forward, but the idea that this would stop a Donald Trump or any president really is almost laughable, right? So in other words, the American public might well demand rather than oppose or simply tolerate a nuclear response, no first use pledge or not, right? So at the end of the day, the argument is, look, what the grim calculus is this. When we see, an attack from another country, when we see an EMP attack, when we see a massive conventional attack or something like that, and we think we need, for whatever reason, to use nuclear weapons to survive, which, again, highly unlikely, but if we did, the intern in the room is not going to go, oh, sir, excuse me, we've got this promise that we made. They're going to be laughed or shoved or kicked right out of the room because nobody cares about that in a situation where your existence is at stake, right? But there's even more to the why they won't believe us. You know how I know they won't believe us? Because we don't believe China. We don't believe China's current declaratory for no first use policy. This is from Paul McCleary in Breaking Defense of September 2020. And this is what it says. In the latest swipe in an increasingly contentious back and forth between Washington and Beijing over nuclear weapons, senior DoD officials said today, I don't believe China when they say they have a no first use policy for their nuclear weapons. The remarks by Robert Sufer, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy, so a really important, nuclear policy guy, right, are part of a larger push by the Trump administration to talk tough on China while trying at the same time to get Beijing to participate in three-way talks with Russia on arms control. Despite already falling under the limits of the New START treaty between the U.S. and Russia, China has refused to engage in any talks alongside the two countries in joining the pact despite U.S. pressure. So one response to the pros claim that if we do a declaratory policy, we'll lower our alert level and reduce our aggressive posture. In other words, we'll get all this stuff, this package deal, right? There's exactly one country in the world that has a declaratory no first use policy, and they don't do that. There is no, when China says they have a declaratory no first use policy, they aren't scaling back their nuclear arsenal. They're trying to double it, right? As we're going to talk about in a little bit, China is actually in the process of seeking to dramatically increase, right, its nuclear arsenal, doubling its size and deploying it in a more aggressive posture, for example, on nuclear submarines and things like that. So the idea that a declaratory no first use policy automatically comes with this package of let's be more pacifistic and let's pull back, that's just not true. The one country in the world that actually does it is doing the opposite of that, right? And it's not just China that we don't believe. Back when the USSR had a no first use policy, back 40 or 50 years ago, we didn't believe them either. This is from Peter Pry in The Hill in June of 2020, Western analysis consistently fail to understand that for both Beijing and Moscow, nuclear war plans are national security crown jewels that they try to protect and conceal behind a bodyguard of lies and disinformation. Trusting open sources and commentary, especially when they intend to cast nuclear doctrine in the most benign way possible, is a big mistake. For example, during the Cold War, the USSR went to extraordinary lengths to misinform Western policymakers and the public that Moscow had a nuclear no first use doctrine. This was intended to conceal its real nuclear war plans that we now know entailed massive nuclear first strike capability early in a conflict. The No First Use disinformation campaign was intended to mobilize Western anti-nuclear activists in and out of government to constrain U.S. nuclear programs and operational plans. So that's 2 for 2. Of the 2 major powers that have had allegedly true no first use policies that they would never use it, literally the only 2 countries to ever fully implement it, with India having a more sort of limited no first use policy, right? Both of them were lying. And we knew both of them were lying, and the whole world knows both of them were lying, and there's no reason to think they would think we weren't lying, so there's no point in doing it at all, right? If anything, it would lower our credibility, right? So strong argument that nobody would believe it. I know we've gone on for a while, but I think it's worth hitting from multiple angles, right? The second major point I'd make when I'm on the con is that the steps that we could take to actually maybe make up people believe us, right? These things like scaling back ICBMs, lowering our alert level, these things are extra topical. They are not things that you can vote for in this round, right? So when experts are asked, will other countries believe a declaratory no first use policy, the answer is always the same. Like when we look at all these alleged pro sources, right, they always say they'll believe it if we back it up with other steps to change our deployment posture and our alert level. So for example, the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation has this, it says myth. U.S. allies and adversaries will not believe a U.S. NFU policy. Reality. Like any political commitment, the credibility of an NFU policy will rely on the actions of the United States to back it up. And then they talk about how people will believe it if we are de-alerting the land-based leg of the triad, right? The ICBMs, right? And if we are reevaluating the necessity of the ICBM force altogether. Well, there's 2 big problems with that. Number one is, as we discussed earlier, these are all extra topical, right? The resolution says adopt a declaratory nuclear policy of no first use, and if the judge accepts that that's a piece of paper that says what we will do, then all of this other stuff, you can't vote for it, right? It's not going to happen. You can't fiat it. Remember, fiat means the magical ability of the judge to make the resolution happen. This is not part of the resolution, assuming you win that definitional fight, right? So the judge can't vote for it, and you should basically tell them that's a nice benefit, but you're not voting for that in this round. It won't happen when you cast your ballot, so it's basically irrelevant. The second thing to back that up is, like we said earlier, you can look to real world examples like China. When they adopted a declaratory no first use policy, they have not done, dramatically scale back their nuclear arsenal, right? According to Paul McCleary in Breaking Defense, the Pentagon estimates that China is working to double the number of nuclear warheads in its arsenal over the next decade to around 400, even though with that expected growth, China's nuclear force would still be dwarfed by the United States. It's a lot bigger. So if we can't even get China to agree not to double the size of its nuclear arsenal while it's doing declaratory no first use, what chance do we have of saying that the United States is going to do things like getting rid of its ICBMs? It's not. It's just not. And even if you think it might, you can't vote for it in this round because it's not part of the resolution. It's extra topical, which just means it's something that could happen in addition to a topical plan, right? But it is not part of the advocacy that you get to call for the judge to fiat. Right? And that's the basic problem, right? Now, there are other points. So, for example, right now, there's a contention in and of itself, right? That the time is wrong to adopt no first use because China is moving toward a more aggressive nuclear posture, right? If we were ever going to do it, now is not the time, right? So James Holmes in The Hill, September 10, 2020, China's worrisome edge toward a launch on warning nuclear posture. And they talk about a U.S. report on China's changing nuclear posture. And it says, what's worrisome is the report's conjecture that Beijing is edging away from its longstanding no first use policy toward a launch on warning posture. That's what former Senator Sam Nunn, a longtime arms control stalwart, calls a hair trigger approach to releasing nuclear weapons. That would be a dramatic departure. China's leadership long contented itself with a minimal deterrent force composed of a few land-based ballistic missiles. It accepted a striking degree of vulnerability to superpower coercion while while forswearing the first use of nuclear weapons. By contrast, a contender that embraces launch on warning policy reserves the right to cut loose with nuclear counterstrikes before an incoming raid hits home. It refuses to take the first punch before retaliating. So the idea here is, again, it illustrates how meaningless a declaratory no first use policy is, right? But more importantly, it shows like now is definitely not the time to relax deterrence, right? Because China is beginning to test the waters of being the first use power, right? Doubling the size of its arsenal. And if the United States were to back off and declare no first use, we would be declaring a massive position of weakness in comparison to China for no reason. This would be a huge strategic unforced error to allow an authoritarian regime to seize the reins of the possibility of a first strike, and that would be a bad idea, right? Another response to the idea we talked about earlier that the idea of no first use is this antiquated relic of the Cold War, there's actually a counter argument to that there are in fact realistic scenarios where the threat of first use is actually a necessary deterrent. This comes from Brad Roberts in 2019 debating no first use again, and he explains the rationale for the Obama administration's rejection of no first use. And he basically says that, look, we know that mass, war between superpowers, certainly nuclear war, is highly, highly unlikely, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. And he talks about how the Obama administration's understanding was that Russia had a belief that it could just keep escalating conventional war so high that its opponents like the United States and European powers would basically just give up, right? They could invade Crimea and invade Ukraine and roll in there, and if they didn't meet opposition, great, right? They got what they wanted. If they did meet opposition, they were committed to keep upping the stakes on conventional warfare so high that their opponent would just decide that it's not worth it, right? And the idea is by keeping nuclear response on the table, even though it's not perfect, it didn't keep them out of Ukraine and Crimea, it's strong enough that it gives them an extra added threat to worry about, that if the escalation gets too high, they might trigger World War III and annihilation, which is just one more thing to make them think about and be uncertain about and reduce the likelihood of them being the aggressor in Eastern Europe and other places. Even if we don't actually intend to do it, right? This is important. This is an important point generally for the con, is to say, look, you don't have to actually intend for us to do this. You can totally think that we would be bluffing, that we would never do this, but we should let them think that we will do it if that adds even 1/10% more deterrence to keep them from escalating the tension and ratcheting up their aggression in places like Eastern Europe, right? There's another response to a common pro-argument about proliferation. This also comes from John Harvey, which is that no first use won't help non-proliferation and it may actually harm it. Here's what he says. And I just love this John Harvey article because he just speaks in such plain terms. It's just really good stuff for a PF round because it just makes sense, right? Some argue that adopting a no first use policy would set an example and cause nuclear adversaries to follow America's lead. In other words, this is not just about non-proliferation, but this is just like being a good example to the world. If promises were kept, this would allow the U.S. conventional juggernaut to win wars absent the threat of nuclear use. But this outcome is unlikely. Indeed, several nuclear adversaries have acquired or are seeking to acquire nuclear weapons precisely to offset U.S. conventional capabilities. In other words, it may be that countries look at the United States' conventional capabilities and say, they're so much stronger than us conventionally that we need to do what they did back in the 1940s and 50s. We actually need to go get more nuclear weapons because their conventional forces are so much more powerful. So the idea of taking nuclear weapons off the table might not make it less likely that they get nuclear weapons. It might have no effect, or it might conceivably make it more likely that they seek some kinds of strategic nuclear weapons to offset our conventional capabilities if that's what we rely on. So again, quoting Tierney, if a president made a dramatic announcement of no first use, it would probably have less impact than people think because other countries wouldn't follow suit, especially if they're weak. Would U.S. adoption of no first use cause other countries to be more inclined to cooperate with the United States to work toward a strengthened non-proliferation regime and less likely to acquire nuclear weapons? No evidence exists to support such a contention, and as noted above, Allied perceptions of weakened extended deterrence could actually spur proliferation, right? So the argument here, and something I would press the pro on, is there any actual empirical evidence? Other than just dueling experts where somebody says this is likely to happen and somebody says this is not likely to happen, is there any actual empirical evidence anywhere, any kind of statistic or study or anything that actually shows that any country would say, oh, well, the United States issued a piece of paper saying it won't nuke us first, I guess I don't need nuclear weapons anymore? I mean, they don't get nuclear weapons to fight the United States in the first place. They get them to keep their rival next door from ever thinking about invading, right? At any rate, And then the final argument I have, just sort of major argument, is if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? And the basic argument here, as we talked about earlier, is nuclear peace theory, which is we have had a policy of optional first use, potential first use, since 1948, since just after World War II, and it has worked, right? At the end of the day, the proof is in the pudding, right? We have had no major great power conflicts, no wars between the United States and Russia, no wars with China, no wars with any other nuclear power, right? At the end of the day, this has been effective at deterring major conflicts around the world, right? And so if you look at just the history of the 20th century, fewer people have died since the invention and spread of nuclear weapons, as noted by Michael Schellenberger in 2018. The number of deaths in battle has declined by 95% in the 70 years since nuclear weapons were introduced. And he also links to some other really good sites that talk about how war casualties are down and things like that, right? There are also empirical studies that show that nuclear threats do de-escalate conventional conflicts. So one that we cited to in our LD video was from Bueno de Mesquita and Riker in 1982. It's a little bit old, but it does find that empirically, the closer proximity nuclear weapons have to a conflict, like either you have them or your allies have them or something like that, the closer they are to a conflict, the less likely it is actually to escalate. So there is empirical support for that. But the basic idea is, at the end of the day, if this policy has worked and kept us from having a nuclear war for 70 years, right, then there has to be you should just say, the pros should have to give you overwhelming, strong evidence that we're going to go from a risk that looks like it's zero, right, or very close to zero, to something even lower. And what's at stake is annihilation, right? It's war, right? At minimum, it's conventional war, right? It's potentially nuclear annihilation. So, Judge, the pro's burden is to show you that a likelihood that already seems to be very close to zero will somehow go down, and they should have to do it by very convincing evidence, because what's at risk is doing away with the peace and the absence of major conflict, both conventional and nuclear, right, over the last 70 years, and they can't meet that burden. Definitely, they should have the heavy burden of proof, and if it's even close in your mind, you should be voting con, because the status quo has worked. It has worked consistently. It has prevented great power wars, and it has prevented nuclear wars. So again, I would want to debate on the con on this. I just think it's better because I'm a cynic. I like it. But at any rate, those are the arguments. So really quickly, let's turn and do some final thoughts. Okay, so final thoughts. Like we said earlier, this is a resolution on which you are not going to have like absolute empirical studies that you can just beat your opponent over the head with on either side. It's going to require logic. Logic in explaining why people will believe it, logic in explaining why people won't believe it, logic in explaining deterrence theory, why it does work, why it doesn't work. You're going to have to be able to tell stories about how leaders will make decisions in tense situations with a declaratory no first use policy and without, right? And you need to practice explaining those things. Practice explaining them to your parents, practice explaining them to your coach, to non-specialists in a very quick, bite-sized way that makes sense, because just reading cards of my expert is more expert than your expert, is going to get tedious pretty fast. And any debater who can come in and give logical explanations about how the decision calculus will work will have a big advantage. So I hate that we finished up this lousy calendar year with what I don't think is a great topic. Your mileage may vary. You may love it. You may think it's fantastic. But I hate that we had to finish it up this way. But I'm sure you guys and girls are going to go out there and make lemonade out of lemons and do a fantastic job and do things that I couldn't even predict. So again, thanks for your patience as we made this video. We'll try to get the next few out as fast as we can. Hope you've had a great virtual debating 2020. Maybe we'll have a vaccine soon. And we'll be back to debating at real tournaments. Maybe we'll see you there. But until then, we will close the video the same way we close all of our videos, by saying, remember that debate is for everybody. So work hard, have fun, and Hail State.